Assalamu alaikum. This is Layla Abdullah-Poulos, and welcome to NBA Muslims. You're used to me interviewing authors, but like last time, I've pulled in a brilliant Muslim woman to discuss some issues that are affecting the Muslim community. And so the Muslim woman scholar who has graced us with her presence today is Camila Rashad. Camila is the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing stigma associated with mental illness, addiction, and trauma in the American Muslim community through dialogue, education, and training. Muslim Wellness Foundation envisions a future in which faith communities are at the forefront of mental health advocacy and committed to developing an inclusive culture of compassion, understanding, and support. Camila is a fellow for spirituality, wellness, and social justice at the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn. She served 3 years as the Muslim chaplain at UPenn and continues to facilitate discussions on religious identity, development, and challenges faced by American Muslim youth. She is also a resource to the wider Penn community and administration on Islam and Muslims. In addition to Camila's involvement in mental health advocacy and religious life, like that's not enough, she is a proud social justice activist working to inspire, empower, and support grassroots mobilization and direct action to address police brutality, racial and religious profiling, unlawful surveillance, and the over-policing of America's Black and Brown communities. Assalamu alaikum, Camila, and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for inviting me and having me on such an important conversation. Inshallah, it will be fruitful and beneficial for everyone who decides to tune in.
Well, thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy life to do this. And I know Black Muslim, the title of our discussion is Black Muslim Resistance, Asserting Our Space in the American Muslim Ummah, and that is a big thing. And I know we're not going to get to cover everything that we want to cover, but I'm hoping that we could focus on a few things and you can give me your perspective on it. And so one of the things that I think people often need a lot of clarity on is just this whole idea of who are the Black Muslims?
Yes. So that term, I think we should clarify, was a term that was historically used or initially used to describe members of the Nation of Islam. And so when we reference Black Muslims, sometimes people will, I guess, think of that era. But when I use it, or when many people use the term Black Muslims, it's really to describe not a homogenous group of people. So you have African Americans, descendant of enslaved Africans. You have those who are, African immigrants, perhaps, or children of immigrants. And also includes Muslims of African descent who are from the Caribbean. And so, we have a lot of diversity within that group, that category. But it's important for people to know, despite the lack of images of Black Muslims, we are comprised about a third of the American Muslim community. And unfortunately, I think the most accessible frames of reference usually have to do with athletes and entertainers. And so, people are familiar with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, perhaps with Mos Def, with Dave Chappelle, and of course with Muhammad Ali, may Allah have mercy on his soul. And so when we talk about Black Muslims, I think we have to understand that it's a very heterogeneous, kind of diverse community in and of itself, and that it includes those who consider themselves Sunni Muslim. There's also a Shia Black Muslim component, and also those who are still members of the Nation of Islam. And so in my work, and from my perspective, I see it as our sort of collective genealogy, how Islam evolved in the United States, how it evolved within the Black community. And so whether or not there are theological sort of differences or debates about what's considered Orthodox Islam or prototypical Islam, I think it's important for us to know that history, because it's our genealogy. So we have to know sort of how the community developed over, I would say, the last 150 years.
And I also think that, people are quite surprised by the, like you said, the heterogeneous nature of Black Muslims, and even the fact that they exist, because I think every African American Muslim kind of got that "where are you from" question and a look of surprise, which is kind of ironic considering that Black Muslims, particularly African American Muslims, played such a vital role in Islam becoming a recognizable American religion. What do you think happened from us being in the forefront?
Yes, I think a few things happened. 9/11 happened. And there was like an intentional push, even within policy, to make Islam foreign. That in order to think about Islam being present in this country, that would completely shift sort of the narrative and the conversation about Islam being a threat. Because if it wasn't a threat for the last 100 years or so, then what has fundamentally changed? Nothing. And so I think with the with 9/11 and kind of the intentional push to within media, within kind of broader mainstream narratives, talk about Islam as something that is imported, something that is foreign, something that is threatening. There was an erasure of Black Muslims. And so I think along with that, we have to kind of look within the Muslim community and talk about how that erasure was maintained or is still maintained, such that the broader kind of American community seems to not be aware of who we are. And so, I mean, to be
well, I also think that the Muslim communities in and of themselves are responsible. There's some complicity in that when there is opportunity to discuss the American Muslim perspective, the broader society is very ready to simplify it into this ideal type of what an American thinks a Muslim is, which, like you said, is foreign. There's a certain phenotype, and non-Black Muslims haven't really pushed back against that for quite a long time. You have a few that have, Khalid Beydoun, for example, Namira Islam, but overall, I think that the non-Black Muslim community has been all too ready to just make it about non-Black Muslims and not say, we have past Muhammad Ali.
Right.
And Malcolm X, we have the Black Muslims in their totality and bringing us to the table and bringing us in front of the cameras. And I'm just kind of curious as to why you think that has occurred.
Well, I think that is symbolic of the fact that we are still a very segregated community. And because think about the people who are in your social networks, right? If you're thinking about, well, who has expertise in this area, you may pull from, not just within the Black Muslim community, but those who have a demonstrated sort of expertise. But if you live in a very segregated world, even within the Muslim community, then you're going to tap the people that you know. And so when things happen and Black Muslims rightfully point out, well, how can you talk about American Muslims without the inclusion of Black Muslims? That I think is, at times, I wouldn't say it's intentional. I think it's just a reflection of the lack of, I see you disagree, but I think well, not intentional in the sense that it's very microaggressive. And so it takes for people to be aware that when you are engaging in a conversation, you have to always ask yourself, who is not here, right? But even in order to ask that question, you have to be aware of the existence of multiple communities within kind of the broader American Ummah. And so we have to, I think, take responsibility for the fact that we are still a very segregated community, whether it's urban versus suburban, it's, predominantly South Asian, predominantly Arab, Masajid. But what are we doing in order to break down some of those barriers? Because if we are familiar with the history and we have actual sincere relationships with people who are different from us, then we will know the kind of the full potential of the expertise that we actually have in the community.
Well, I do. Maybe because let me like bring it more down personal. I know that it's not that's not reflective of an entire culture, and I'm not saying that it is,
Sure.
but I just from the perspective of I'm a suburban Muslim. I live in the suburbs outside of New York City, and the way that Muslim communities have developed here on Long Island, the very first masjid that was on Long Island was a black, predominantly black masjid. So they're the first ones. Black Muslims, African American Muslims in particular, were the first ones to establish a masjid
Okay.
on Long Island. And then, and non-black Muslims, immigrant Muslims and immigrant descent Muslims started attending that masjid. And then they started building masajid of their own, which is great. That happened in one county. And then it happened in another where it was not particularly African American Muslims, but one Caribbean Muslim and a Latino Muslim, where they kind of established a masjid here. And what slowly began to happen was that got forgotten.
Yeah.
Okay, so the black masjid in one particular area was completely erased from the dialogue on Long Island, and the media focused on these predominantly non-black masajid, and they were all too comfortable with forgetting about the black Muslims the same way that the media has. They didn't kind of like pull them in and say, okay, well, no, there's this perspective as well.
Right.
And to the point where it seems like this one masjid that was established some 15, 20 years later is the foundational masjid in the area. It's the first Muslim mosque on Long Island. And it's like, no, that's not true. And they do know it. The thing is that they do know it because they've interacted with that community. And so for them to just kind of like gloss over that, I think that they're complicit in it. And I just see too often, even when they try to seem inclusive, it's often tokenism, and any substantial contribution that a black Muslim may make is completely glossed over. So I may just be being kind of pessimistic about it.
Well, not pessimistic, but I would think about the ways in which, even within the Muslim community, we replicate some of the broader structures, right? That serve to exclude Black people in general. And so, you know, when we were kind of talking off air, I said before I have conversations with people about racism and about racial injustice, I think it's important to define what we mean by those terms, because we may be coming to the conversation from a very different perspective. And so there are times in which we use terms like oppression and marginalization and racism, discrimination, and we haven't clearly defined how we're going to sort of develop a conversation around that. And so for me, being able to talk about racism means that we agree on a fundamental premise, right, from the very beginning. And for me, that premise is acknowledging that racism is pervasive. So this structural system, like a system that we live in, right, which is predicated on the belief in white superiority and Black inferiority, okay? And so there are structures in place that reinforce that idea. So at this point, you know, when we think about, you know, people say like a colorblind society or post-racial society, those structures are still in place. So it is not necessary to talk about individual people who may have had an epiphany and are ready to, you know, be more inclusive and more, I don't even like to use the word tolerant, but are able to acknowledge the richness and diversity. There are still structures in place. So if we have not dismantled the structures, racism is self-perpetuating, right? It's pervasive, it's systemic, it's sometimes overt, but it's also invisible. So we have to agree that it's sort of in the air that we breathe, right? Just on the premise. And because of that, there are disparities that we're going to see in almost every field of human endeavor. You're going to see disparities in education, which again, disproportionately impact in a negative way Black people. You're going to see disparities in business, in law, in medicine. And so when we think about what happens within the American Muslim community, it is just a reflection of what's happening in the broader American community. There's always this constant distancing from Blackness, right? Because it is perceived to be inferior. And I think these are some of the things that we have to just accept as part of our reality, because if we don't accept it, then we're not going to be able to challenge it effectively. And so when you see the exclusion of Black people, kind of linking it back to how did Islam become foreign to American soil post 9/11, I think the complicity within the non-Black Muslim community was to sort of cling to this idea that we are different, right? We're not like those Black people who have been historically subjugated and inferior. So let me show you how I'm a good Muslim, right? Let me show you how somehow I'm exceptional, somehow I'm different, and I should not be treated this way. And so when you start to distance yourself from Blackness and see it as a detriment, right, to your success, then you're also going to distance yourself from Black Muslims. And in that distancing, there's a lack of acknowledgement of history, right? So how many people, even within the Black Muslim community, are aware of sort of the roots of Islam extending back hundreds of years in this country? And for that, you know, we have a limited amount of time, but for that, I would definitely advise, you know, people who are listening and watching to read Antebellum Islam by Khalid Beydoun, because it talks about, you know, how slave codes were enacted to begin to separate kind of Blackness from Islam, and how even enslaved Muslims were penalized for trying to retain their spiritual practice. So this idea that, you know, anti-Muslim sentiment is new, one, is false if we know our history. And so I guess when I'm thinking about the most productive way to kind of talk about some of the tensions and divisions within the Muslim community, it is to go back to say, well, what is true of the broader community? And to know that American Muslims are not immune from replicating those structural inequalities.
So is there, it seems like there's very much a transference of, despite the fact that it is completely anti-ethical to Islamic teachings, right, especially notions of there's no oppositional binary based on skin tone in Islam, and it's actually a skin tone is actually eye of Allah, and this whole idea of brotherhood. It seems to be some transference of the broader racist structure in the United States has saturated into Muslim communities.
Yes. And that's, yeah. And that's part of what I think we have to acknowledge from the outset, that American Muslims are not immune from internalizing racism, right? It's pervasive. It's part of the foundation of this country. But again, we have to agree before we even continue a conversation about that it exists, right? And there are ways in which it is designed to always exclude Black people, to erase Blackness, or to see it as inferior. And so when we see that happening in Muslim spaces, one, we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because although our religion teaches us otherwise, these were conversations that were happening in the Prophet's time. So we know kind of this idea about negative associations of Blackness are not like a 21st century modern phenomenon. When, you know, the Prophet had to say in his last sermon, look, there's no white who's superior to a Black, no Arab who's superior to a non-Arab. So for me, that always helps elevate the discussion to say, we've had to, over centuries, deal with this idea of Black inclusion. And now this is a more recent manifestation, and there are, you know, historical events which have triggered kind of this process of us having to re-examine why. So within a strictly American context, yes, this is the way it's designed, and the idea of success in America. I think success for many who have immigrated to this country is around this idea of aspiring to success that looks very much according to criteria set forth by white people. So whether it's being upwardly mobile, it's you know, really just kind of complicity in capitalism, being seen as like an educated professional. In order to buy into this idea of American dream, which is a myth, you have to accept certain premises, right? And one of those is that Black people are inferior, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we don't talk about, you know, kind of the American myth around meritocracy and this ability to kind of, you know, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and you know, that is, anyone can succeed here. You also have to believe that these structures don't exist. That is all based on individual merit. We know this is false.
It is just completely laughable, because even if you just look at African-American history, I mean, it is ripe with people who were brilliant and exceptional and still couldn't get a leg up in this country. So that whole myth of American meritocracy is, I'm sorry, I just had to, every time I hear it, I got to chuckle. But I think that you're absolutely right. I think that it is something that anti-Blackness is something that has been an issue in Islam, and also when you come and you have this American racist structure applied to it, and you may be, you know, people may be bringing in their own anti-Blackness from their cultures. Absolutely. I mean, let's not pretend that, you know, if you go overseas, all of a sudden this doesn't matter anymore, right? Because it does.
You know, otherwise.
And so there's a lot to resist, because there may be a marginalization of Blacks in where you come from.
Right.
And then you come over here and you want this American dream, which is very, very much comes with a white facade on it.
Yeah.
Okay. So success and whiteness are directly correlated in this society, and it functions so that white means successful and Black means non-successful.
Right.
So when you come in and you may be bringing in your own biases from your culture, it's very, very easy to just kind of like slip right into that racial structure, especially when the racial structure will allow you to have some, what Edward Bernina Silva, because when you posted him on Twitter, I was like, oh yeah, I remember his book, what he calls honorary whiteness.
Yes. Yes.
You know, so this honorary whiteness, where the white racial structure needs a buffer, ethnicities to keep it away further and further away from Blackness. And there's been various buffer ethnicities that have served that purpose. You've had Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and brown Asian Americans, so Cambodians and Laotians, and you've had Latinos serve that purpose as well. And so now you have Southeast Asians and some Middle Easterners that serve that purpose. They become a buffer community, and so they have some privilege, some white privilege.
Right. And I think it's also important.
It's comfortable.
Right. I think it's also important to remember that that way of perceiving Black people is also rewarded, right, in certain ways, right? There's some secondary gain that people may experience by distancing themselves from Black people. And so, you know, I'm all about kind of like stating what is your thesis, what is your fundamental premise. And I think in these conversations, we just have to be able to point out, you know, kind of just honestly that, you know, negative stereotypes about Black people are pervasive. And these are images that are broadcast worldwide, that there is a narrative about, you know, Black people being lazy, uneducated, unmotivated. These were tropes about Black Americans that were cultivated from times of American slavery, right? So this is, again, sort of fundamental to how you maintain a structure that says white people are superior and Black people are inferior. And then the people, sort of the racial composition of people in between serves to say, well, at least we're not on the bottom, right? And so the thinking may be, why would I even choose to interrogate these assumptions about Black people when everything around me reinforces the idea that they're true, right? So there has to be, I think, some kind of awakening to say, why is it that this is the way things are structured? And I would say the part of the awakening is to think about how have Black people and Black Muslims specifically been able to survive and thrive in spite of the fact that everything is structured to send the message that we are inferior, that we are worthless, that we have no value. And so when we can say this is not true, think about how have Black Muslims resisted. I see that this is our ability to resist this, I feel, is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there is no other explanation for how over hundreds and hundreds of years of degradation, of subjugation, of dehumanization, we have almost outside of any outside intervention, even been able to find our way back to Islam, right? If I know my fourth great grandparents were enslaved in Tennessee, how is it possible that their great 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 granddaughter was able to find Islam, born into the religion? And so I see this, you know, if we're able to recognize, you know, the significance of the history that has propelled us and the resistance that has sustained us, then that should be a source of inspiration and of understanding. And one of the things that I think about in terms of understanding Black Muslim resistance, it comes from Dr. Sherman Jackson, from his book, Islam, excuse me, Islam and the Black American, looking forward, no, Islam and the Black American, looking toward the third resurrection. So that would be another recommendation of mine, Dr. Sherman Jackson, out in California. And he says Black religion, you know, is something that we carried with us. And he talks about, in this book, he says, American Islam owes its momentum to this distinctly American phenomenon of Black religion, a God-centered holy protest against anti-Black racism that emerged out of the experience of American slavery. And so when we talk about faith and spiritual practice also being a way in which to assert our sense of freedom and dignity, it is no wonder that many people, many Black Muslims come to Islam, yes, thinking about it as a way of life, as a spiritual practice, but that it is also resistance as a way of life. It is a way to say, my only submission is to the will of God. I will not submit to white supremacy. I will not submit to belief in Black inferiority. And so this is our relationship to Islam. One of the, I think, quotes that kind of highlights this is also from Keith Ellison. And there was an interview with him, and he talked about this idea of Black religion. And he says, Black religion is the idea that everything has forsaken you, but the divine has not. It's all gone. It has all been stripped away, but there is still God, and that's all there is. You know, people struggling during slavery, who were they calling out to in those fields? Who were they crying for? Nobody could protect you. If you were a woman, your husband couldn't protect you from your slave master. So it's the idea that the Lord will sustain you and is the only one that can get you through what you're going through. So in this light, the Islamic Shahada, the belief that there is no God but God, makes perfect sense. And when we understand that that is our sort of relationship and kind of tie to Islam, is one of liberation, of freedom, and of dignity, then we of course are going to resist. That's something that becomes part of our sort of spiritual DNA. You look like you had a question for me.
Huh?
I said you look like you had a question.
I love that quote. But I mean, and it also demonstrates something that I think many times Black Americans lose sight of and non-Black Americans lose sight of, and that is the extensiveness of this heritage of Black Muslim resistance, particularly African Americans, but also just across up and down the Americas. You know, when I went to the Black Muslim Psychology conference and I attended one presentation, and I forgot his name. He was so brilliant too. And he talked about that. He talked about this continuum of resistance from the slave revolts in the Caribbean involving Black Muslims to in the United States, into the Black Muslim movement and beyond.
Yes.
So there's this heritage of resistance that we always forget. And one quote that I have is from Donna Austin. We don't want to acknowledge that there is a very deep history of racism, anti-Blackness racism in Muslim communities. So we are actually, that heritage is now something that we have to draw on as as Black Muslims,
Yes.
to resist things inside of the Muslim community as well. So,
Right.
in a, mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that, again, is something that we just have to acknowledge, right? This is not a time to say, well, you know, there's guilt and blame and shaming of people. But if we can just get to the point where we can acknowledge that anti-Black racism, right, is pervasive in the world, it's a global phenomenon. It is also pervasive within the American Muslim community. We are not immune, you know, from some of these social ills. And part of what education is a component, I think, of being able to come to a place of acknowledgement. And this is why I love the work of Muslim Arc. And so that would be another plug. I think everyone, I don't talk about the organization enough, is that everyone should go to the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative website and just, you know what, you don't even have to agree, right? Just go read. Because I think when people are able to come to a point of saying, well, what education am I lacking? Then they can see where there's some gaps in kind of their own understanding. And so, you know, when I think about the history of resistance, you know, again, in the Western Hemisphere, I think about the Bahia slave rebellion in Brazil, right? And this was orchestrated by African Muslims. This was, from what I've read, during the last 10 days of Ramadan, right? 1835, right? They were aware of the Haitian Revolution, and it was at the kind of inspired by these African Muslims, West African Muslims, that this rebellion was able to take place. And, you know, there's accounts that they were dressed in kind of this Muslim garb. They had prayer beads. So they were undeniably Muslim and Black. And so being able to set an example for what does it look like, again, to use your faith as a source of inspiration, and to reaffirm the fact that I will not submit my will to any man. I will not submit my will to white supremacy, but that it will always be to the submission of God. And so how can I live my life, right, in subjugation if I call myself a Muslim? How can I live my life going with allowing oppression not to be challenged if I call myself a Muslim?
Well, I think that if I have, like you said, first of all, there has to be an understanding of how am I, first of all, am I as a Muslim complicit in the oppression that's taking place? So I think that education becomes very, very important. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, because a lot of times we kind of think of, I'm feeling a certain kind of way, so I may be using a certain kind of language. Okay, and I apologize if it offends anyone. But this facade of brotherhood, not that in Islam there isn't this idea of brotherhood in an ummah, in a community, but I, as a Black Muslim, have not really seen it concretely crystallized in the broader American Muslim ummah.
Yes.
And I think it's because of this transference of white supremacy and racism in Muslim communities. And until Muslims understand that, you know, we may be complicit in it and learn how we may be complicit in it, which Muslim Arc serves as a really, really good resource for that.
Definitely.
We can't get to that next step of even appreciating the heritage of resistance and ownership that Black Muslims have in the Western Hemisphere. So not let alone this country, but in the entire Western Hemisphere. So it seems like we have to take step by step. So really learning where it is that bias or that even out and out racism. I mean, because let's be honest, you know, who hasn't been called a slave in Arabic or called, I forget the word for it, in Urdu. Okay. And it wasn't until someone who spoke Urdu told me what it was. I was like, wait a second, I heard that word a lot.
And think about how disappointing and devastating that could be for someone who comes to Islam, you know, thinking about in terms of freedom, you know, freedom from some of these racial structures, and to find that that is still present, right? I think, you know, there are times that we don't acknowledge not just that is disrespectful, right? But that it is painful for people who have under tremendous pressure, been able to even set a precedent so that people can practice freely, right? When you think about how so many of the laws, think about Muslims who are incarcerated and really would advocate for, being able to dress a certain way, being able to grow a beard, being able to, eat halal food, that there is a precedence that has been set for Black Muslims such that we've been the pioneers and kind of paved the way, and it has made it less difficult for other people to practice Islam in America. And so I think two things need to happen. That in order to kind of get over this idea of like a colorblind sort of racial society, it will in fact take, among other things, that non-Black Muslims, again, acknowledge that they sort of bought into this myth of an America that is equal, that thrives on democracy and meritocracy, and anyone can be successful. This is not what, when people say, oh, not my America, I'm like, we live in two different Americas, right? In that at a certain point, there has to be just an admission that when you think about the enslavement of Black people, hundreds of years, right? This was no blip on the radar, hundreds of years. When you think about the systemic genocide of First Nation people, this is what America is built on, right? So for those who are immigrating here, right, and even those children of immigrants, right, some of that kind of cultural expectation is passed down. There has to be an admission that I am here on stolen soil, right, cultivated by stolen people. And that's hard. That's very difficult to acknowledge. And so when you come here just expecting, well, look, I'm coming here to get mine, I'm coming here to, educate my children, have a better life, to admit that you're building your success, right, on the murder and the genocide and the enslavement of people, that creates like a huge cognitive dissonance. So people really don't want to go there. But I think it's important. So just the acknowledgement that, this kind of American myth or dream serves to obscure some of the really ugly reality. And I think for Black Muslims, I think for people witnessing, and this is why I think the Black Muslim Psychology Conference was so beautiful, I think is being able to sit and just witness the pain of a people who have endured, right, despite the historical sort of anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Blackness, and what has given us the ability to do that. I think it is in understanding Islam as a means to freedom and to liberation. And so when we talk about resistance, it's really talking about how we live. Right. This is not, something that's trending and, I go to a protest, and my very existence speaks to the resistance of a people. And so when we try to communicate that, I think it has to be with an understanding that we have had centuries, right, of not having the luxury of pretending that this is a meritocracy. We have not had the luxury or the privilege of assuming that this place is somehow going to be or designed for our success. And so when we think about where we are in 2017, non-Black Muslims, right, have to be willing, again, to educate themselves, to acknowledge that, part of the success in this life is built on a myth, and it's built on the backs of people. And for Black Muslims, not only to talk about how we've resisted, but the toll that it has taken to do so. So I have one. I have one more recommendation just around this idea of like colorblind ideology, and that's an article by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. The Structure of Racism in Colorblind Post-Racial America, something I tweeted out today. People need to read that, right? We are on the cusp of inaugurating someone whose whole campaign, right, was to remind white people why they are superior, to remind white people why they feel
to reinforce the delusion, to reinforce the delusion
right,
in white people that they are superior.
right. So imagine.
And I think that.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm waiting for you.
I think that is very, very important for non-Black Muslims to really, really investigate and learn about the Black Muslim resistance throughout history, throughout American history. I think because, like you said, there's this whole idea that you can slip into the society and not be touched by systemic racism and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. And so when you turn around and you are touched by it, you're still feeding off of the delusion that somehow if you cater to the dominant society enough, if you placate the dominant society enough, you'll be able to take that place back. And I remember Namira Islam, I can't quote her verbatim, but I remember when she said, you're not going, there's no going back. Non-Black Muslims, there's no going back.
Right. Look, the jig is up. The jig is up.
I think because, it's up. Look at what's happening with what has been happening with this entire population of Muslims, and to think that it's somehow because just solely on the color of their skin, it's actually you feeding into it. You thinking that the whole idea of perpetual subjugation that Blacks in America and Black Muslims in America have been fighting against and resisting against and surviving and actually thriving and excelling at certain times, it is because of the color of our skin is the reason why we're still at this certain level, and not because of systemic white supremacy and racism is incredulous. And it just really means that you really actually think it's the color of our skin, because we have examples in Black history of Blacks excelling, and Black Wall Street. Right. We didn't destroy that. A bunch of angry white people came in and decided, no, they got too much. We're going to take that away from them. Rosewood, and even I think the Trump election is definitely reflective of this whole idea that because of the binary that exists between Blackness and whiteness, that once Obama was elected, it struck a fear in the general white society, even though so many whites voted him in. I'm talking about that underseated belly of racism that exists in white society. And that, oh my God, the Blacks are getting something. Look at this. No, that's supposed to be ours. That's supposed to be exclusively ours all the time. First of all, it's supposed to be exclusively male. Okay, so that's why they want to keep Hillary out. Right. But it's definitely supposed to be exclusively white. So how you get this Black person in office? Though we gotta readjust and get things back to the way put the white back in White House, type of thing. So when you're looking at that, and you're kind of thinking that somehow that this system that is very much at the underpinnings of this country. First of all, the idea that, oh no, not my America. No, this has been, yes, it's your America. This is your America. This is the America that is on top of the bodies of Native peoples and enslaved peoples and other immigrant populations that came in for that American dream and realized it was an American nightmare.
Exactly.
And they had to get it, like, turn around and start to get things together. But it seems like non-Black Muslims are missing the mark on it, because when you look at things like this whole narrative of Muslims looking feeble, right? Okay, because of all of these attacks and
and I wanted to I think to point out, if we're talking about what is the function of Black Muslim resistance, or the function of understanding it, I think is to provide that counter narrative to the idea that we are just kind of perpetually victimized, that we're frail, that we're weak, that we're impotent. And so if you know the history, even think about how it changes, the way you walk when you're like, we've been rebelling since like a long while, right? We have never accepted this as a reality. So if non-Black Muslims also see those stories and that history as part of their collective history and own it, to say there were there were enslaved African Muslims in Bahia, Brazil in 1835 who rebelled in the last 10 days of Ramadan. That should put a different kind of pep in your step. You know, like we are not just always going to talk about what's happening to us, but we're going to talk about the ways in which we have historically and perpetually pushed back against it. But it takes, again, accepting that racism is pervasive, accepting that the myth of meritocracy has only served to divide, you know, people of different, of people of color, and then saying, well, let me now learn how Black Muslims have resisted, right? You can even go back further in the 1700s, in the 1800s, you know, learning kind of like that antebellum Islam, and then how in the 20th century, we still think about under what conditions do we get someone like an Elijah Muhammad, right? And again, I'm not a theologian. I'm not talking about that aspect, but what he was doing in the 1920s and 30s to say to Black people, you are made in the image of God, right? You deserve better. You can do for yourself. You can be self-determined. You can be independent. You can be self-sufficient. This was like revolutionary. And I feel like it served as a reminder to what we already knew, but we needed someone to tell us. And so when you think about even from the Nation of Islam, and then kind of the evolution to, you know, the W.D. Muhammad community, and then later, we have to accept the whole history, right? This is not time to kind of parse out what you don't like, but it serves as a reminder that there have always been ways in which people have resisted anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Blackness, and also this idea that we are just going to accept, right, these things. And I think the second purpose that understanding Black Muslim resistance serve is to really kind of do away with this idea of like the exceptional Muslim, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, he talked about the exceptional Negro when he talked about the talented 10th. And this was in 1896, I believe. He talked about this talented 10th. And what he said in that essay was the thinking that, and I'm going to quote him directly. He says, the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education then among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented 10th. It is the problem of developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst. And so I think the corollary to this is like this exceptional Muslim, right? If I can prove that I'm patriotic enough, that I'm professional enough, that I'm educated enough, that I'm, you know, good enough, then
just as American,
right? That I'm American enough, right? Then that will somehow stop Islamophobia, right? Even later in his life, W.E.B. Du Bois was like, that whole talented 10 thing, yeah, I may have been wrong about that. And so I think—
yeah, you gotta kind of like, I was feeling a certain kind of way back then.
Exactly. And look, well,
I think the Islam, you mentioned the Nation of Islam, and I mean that was something that they did as well, but they extended it to based on gender. So was it Black communities in Black Americans in totality, it was more inclusive of it included women. And that's one of the things, like, you know, we forget, like, also like Clara Muhammad.
Yes.
Okay. There wouldn't have been a Nation of Islam. It would have fizzled out if it wasn't for her fortitude. Right. And she was responsible for developing educational programs in her school. I mean, you know, say what you want about the heretical nature of a lot of the teachings of the Nation of Islam at that time. If you just look at the resistance in education, right, that Clara Muhammad constructed, that continued even when Muslims started to become more Orthodox Sunni Muslims, you know, they carried that tradition with them. And so you had this whole idea of schooling your own, educating your own, so that they aren't being fed all of this nonsense of inferiority that comes through the history books and everything like that, because everything is very Eurocentric and Christian-centric in public education. And so if you put your kids in there, that's what's going to happen. You're exposing them to it. So they took their kids out of that. And I mean, to this day, the educational structure of the Nation of Islam and the WD Muhammad community in some aspects is phenomenal and really way progressive than the general Muslim population. But, you know, Black Muslims have brought that in too, you know, whether they're going to have, it may be a very, very modest type of school, but the whole idea of educating your own so that they are not indoctrinated into a system that's going to place them as inferior. Right. And have that generational subjugation continue, kind of try to put a stop to that. I mean, that's something that Black Muslims have been doing for decades and decades, even before the boom of immigration.
Right.
And even, you know, because there have been non-Black Muslims from in the late 1800s. You know, we had the Arabs period immigrating into the United States. So they definitely did it differently. So that whole idea that you can look and you can learn from that is very, very significant, because you can't expect you can't put your children in the hands of people that are going to decimate their confidence about their dean. So in the way that the public school system has, and not expect.
I think, you know, as we kind of like wind down, I think the third and kind of final point here is, you know, to understand why were those educational environments so important, and that is to say, what tools are we giving our young people, right, to be able to understand their legacy, right, how they are rooted in the soil. And again, this is whether you're a Black Muslim or not, that is still part of Muslim history, right, in America. And what are we giving them as far as strategy to choose Islam, right? I was talking to a young person today, and I said, even if you are born Muslim, each one of us at some point in our lives, we have to choose Islam, right? We can't just say, oh, well, you know, my mom's Muslim, my whole family is Muslim. We all each have to go through a process, you know, of taking, you know, of declaring, right, that we believe that there is no God but Allah. And when we don't provide enough spaces to guide our children, our young people, emerging adults, to choose Islam, and I'm not a theologian. My background is in psychology and mental health. Thinking about the development of their minds, when we have like a youth intensive or we have these halakas, are we also providing them with the spiritual education, right? Understanding the deen, but also history, right? Teaching them about justice and advocacy. This is also an essential part of what we need to be doing in our halakas. And so when we think about how do we understand racism, understand Black Muslim resistance, and then use it to kind of continue this legacy, it has to be with our young people. And so my next plug would be for, I feel like I'm doing commercials, but Muslim Cool, right? Everyone needs to buy this book, right? So I
want my signed copy from Swan.
You want a signed copy?
I want one so badly.
Well, listen, I think everyone should buy this book, read it with young people. You know, it talks about race, religion, and hip hop in the United States. It does an excellent job of talking about Blackness within the context of citizenship, of culture, of identity, and knowing how they can be able to weave together all of those threads so that they're healthy. You know, if we're thinking about in the next 20, 25 years, what is our community going to look like? Right? When we're looking at an age in which social media also puts pressure on young people, pressure on all of us, to be honest, but thinking about, you know, how vulnerable younger people are, especially, and we've seen some of this in some of the fabricated stories that have come forth about, you know, hate crimes. But I think this is important that we look at that, not in terms of like pathology, but what is happening developmentally. And if we are not talking about not just how we are victimized, but how we resist, right? We can understand the ways in which we are discriminated against, but we also have to understand our own agency and the possibilities that we have for empowerment. And so when we,
Well,
I really love
one good book to go with that. So now I'm going to be plugging to.
Go right ahead.
Because one good book that does go with that, because when you mentioned the false reporting, I think that the portrayal of Muslim women in the society is very, very important. I think it feeds into the general notions of what American Islam is and what American Muslims are. And so I think that, when we look at the resistance from a female perspective, so Black female Muslim resistance, I think one really good book is Women of the Nation by Jamila Karim, because it shows how Black Muslim women in the Nation of Islam, and it's extended. I mean, we have to think of it as a continuum, because it may have started off with the Nation of Islam, but it has since evolved. And so while the nation is still, a Nation of Islam is still here, there is a Black, African-American Muslim women culture. And we draw a lot from that. So from those systems.
Honestly, Layla, I think we can spend a whole hour just talking about Black Muslim women and why there's more discussion.
Okay, so I'll hold you to that. I'm going to hold you.
And everybody's going to be your witness. But one thing I wanted to say about, again, kind of empowering young people, this is an investment in us. This is an investment in the community. So if we are not concerned about how they're developing, if we're not concerned about whether or not they have the tools to be able to continue, kind of this legacy of resistance, then we have failed, right? We can't just kind of blame young people and say, oh, they're always on social media and it's this and that. No, we have failed in some way if we have not asked the right questions to say, what do they need? What do they need from us? We need to allow them space to be able to operate as leaders. They also have wisdom, and one of this quote that I really appreciate from Malcolm X in his speech, he says, one of the first things I think young people should learn is how to see yourself and listen for yourself and think for yourself. Then you can come to an intelligent decision for yourself. How are we doing that? We always talk about the legacy of Malcolm X. Are we creating spaces so that our young people can think for themselves, listen to themselves, can make these intelligent decisions? Then what we value in terms of the historical legacy will not continue if we are not concerned about the pressures, the unique pressures that are on our young people, our young Muslims. And so I'm a proponent of, affinity spaces, for Black Muslim youth, spaces for South Asian and Arab Muslim youth to talk about their unique challenges, and then to think about how do we build coalitions, because we all have some wisdom to share and some value, but we have to be able to do this in a different way. And so acknowledging racism exists, being able to talk about Black Muslim resistance, and then the tools that we want to intentionally provide or co-construct with young people.
And I also think that there needs to be a space for young Muslim women. I think that Muslim women have been, like I said before, the Muslim womanhood has been put on the face of American Islam. Who we are has been simplified. We've become the primary targets because we're the most obvious targets. And I think that, even going back to those false reports, I think there may be subtle differences between how Black and non-Black young Muslim women are navigating through the society and the type of messaging that they're receiving, and how that is presenting itself in these false reports. So I think in addition to race, I think we have to look at the intersection of gender as well, and then kind of come together.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying. And so the reason why I kind of just focus on young people, just sort of in general, is that then we have to talk about leadership. Right? And that has to look a certain way, that has to be diverse, that has to be able to tap into the leadership of Muslim women, of Black Muslim women. It's to talk about how do we empower our young girls, you know, with an education, but then within their own spaces, right? Tell them what they can't do, or they can only be on the children's committee.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
and the whole idea that movements in this society, and even Islam itself, when you look at the Islam itself, it is the contribution of women to making sure that this deen was something that did not die out is always lost. And I think that, considering the fact that, especially if you look at Black Muslim resistance and the totality of resistance, and the fact that women are always at the foundations of those resistant endeavors, it, you know, given what young Muslim women are going through and the messaging they're receiving, I think it does need to be said.
yes. Oh, absolutely. I agree. And I think I would want to dedicate, a time to just talking about that, because I think that's a point that shouldn't be an addendum, but to thinking about the ways in which we're going to socialize our young people to see the importance of having men and women who feel empowered to lead. And so leadership can take different forms. We're not talking about people, leading a prayer. This is not the only form of leadership that we're referencing. And so in order to be as healthy as possible, we need to engage every member of our community, right? And especially our young women. And being able to think about the questions that they have around identity and purpose, right? And I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to kind of summarize to say, there has to be, from the beginning, an acknowledgement of the pervasiveness of racism, including in the American Ummah. And that we have to just see it within the context of this is the broader structure. We are not immune. So whatever we find in the broader community, we're also going to see reflected in our, Muslim community. And so that part of the navigating how willing people are to know that history of racism is just being able to say, I have to mourn the loss of this mythology of America, right? And I think on the other side, for Black Muslims also to acknowledge the tremendous trauma that has happened to us, and the pain that it has caused, even though we still resist and we're proud of that strength, we also have to acknowledge the pain. And then I think we can move into being able to talk about what does then that legacy require of us. And I think it requires that we are investing in young people in a very particular way, to talk to them about social justice, about faith, about identity, and asking them, right, what do you need from us? Right. So kind of co-constructing a meaning of how you become a leader, how you carry on these movements. What does it look like for you in 20 years? Right. How can we invest in you? And so I think that takes some humility on the part of us older Muslim adults, right? Because we have a pre-9/11 experience. It was very different, and I don't want to minimize that. And so we may have to say, okay, they have some wisdom too. Have we tapped into it? Have we thought about their potential and their understanding and their meaning, and been able to sincerely include that in how we construct a new kind of American Muslim community moving forward?
No, I completely agree. I think that it's going to take looking at where we've been and where we want to be, and pulling in the young people, because we're going to be dying out. We just
make it sound so morbid.
I'm going to be honest. I mean, you can't expect anything to move forward on something as frail as the human body. I mean, we just buried Muhammad Ali.
Right.
So absolutely. It's like we have and Junaid Jamshid. It's like we die, and so if we're not if we're not feeding into the youth this confidence, this ability to be self-reliant, to be self-sufficient, to stand up strong, then we're going to take the path. I really think that there is a struggle for the soul of Islam in America. Definitely. And we have got to give to our young people what they need to fight that fight, so that the soul of Islam in the United States is not lost and it becomes some kind of cultural ethnic identification instead of a deen that can positively affect someone's life and give them the ability to navigate through every aspect of their life until they are ready to meet their creator. Yes. So thank you very much, Jamila. I'm sorry, because I was just thinking about Jamila Kareem. Thank you very much, Camila, for joining me in this discussion. I really do think we need to have one on young Muslim women. And maybe we could pull in a young Muslim woman. Yes, and also I'm trying to get Henna Zuberi. I'm trying to get her. I'm going to bug her because I think she's brilliant, and she definitely does give a really, really strong perspective of what's going on in non-Black Muslim communities. So yes. I hope that these conversations continue. And thank you very much for joining us at NBA Muslims. I think I'm going to name it. I was thinking about naming it like Woke Muslim Women.
Oh gosh. I have a love-hate relationship with that word, that phrase woke. But
with the word woke?
Yes.
Oh, we're gonna follow that on Twitter. I'm gonna go on Twitter. You can tell me, because maybe I won't use it anymore. You gotta get your perspective. Jazakallah khairan for joining us, and thank you everyone. And there will be a recording of this in case you want to watch it again, or if someone missed it. And inshallah, look out for the next NBA Muslims online discussion. Assalamu alaikum.